Today, we will focus on the question of whether there can be any objective, scientific assessment of public policy when it comes to economics, or whether any such assessment of economic policy must always be subjectively rooted in people's preferences. In the 1930s, the economist Nicholas Kaldor argued that the capacity for an economy to satisfy preferences does not require interpersonal utility comparisons or any judgment concerning the justice of different distributions. This later became known as the Kaldor-Hicks efficiency criterion. Today, we will examine this criterion and discover its implications for economic public policy analysis. Before proceeding, we should get clear on a few concepts. Satisfying preferences is pretty much how it sounds. So for example, if you choose to go to one restaurant X over another restaurant Y, and if you like the food at restaurant X better than you like the food at restaurant Y, then what we say is that you have satisfied your preferences, at least in this narrow sense, that you've experienced psychological pleasure or certain kinds of satisfaction associated with the food from restaurant X that you wouldn't have experienced with restaurant Y. Now, without getting technical, the term interpersonal comparison of utility has to do with whether economists can use some kind of scientific criterion to rank people's preferences and determine some common unit of measurement as between the two to add preferences and determine which, if they come into conflict, should be used as public policy when voters disagree with each other. Put plainly, what we want to know is this: how should governments give priority to certain preferences of citizens over the preferences of other citizens when framing economic policy? Now, it's worth noting that we are concerned with preferences, and preferences are not necessarily mutually exclusive, although they certainly can be. For example, we can imagine someone, say Brittany, who champions more tax monies for education, agriculture, religious ministries, but since budgets are limited, someone like Brittany, who favors tax money distribution for all of these causes, faces a significant problem. Namely, in order to actually have these policies become reality, she has to convince all of her fellow voters to vote for them. A very tempting knee-jerk response on Brittany's part may be that we ought to divide tax money between all of these organizations equally, and that they are all good causes. The picture looks bleak for her because, as it turns out, if we put Brittany in a room with 9 random strangers, what we would discover is that McKenna might want to allocate more funds to education than Brittany, more monies to government for environmental protection agencies, and less still for religious organizations and to national defense. Now keep in mind, this is only a simplified example, but the point is that things look bleak for Brittany given our hypothetical example that just concerns putting her in a room with 9 people. This may, for example, become much more difficult when we try to extend comparisons of Brittany's preferences to preferences of people living in Uganda. In particular, people living in Uganda may demand less tax money distribution for environmental protection, even if they do care about this cause, precisely because they're more concerned with infrastructure. But Nicholas Kaldor argued that rather than using preferences, we ought to rank public policies according to terms of human welfare. More boldly still, he argued that we can actually rank these policies objectively grounded in scientific observations about the world and about humans in various geographical locations. Now, welfare, understood by Kaldor, is not necessarily an increase in people's preferences and the satisfaction of what those preferences may be, but instead a physical increase in productivity and in physical resources, which adds up to an aggregate rise in the income levels of all citizens. Basically, Kaldor is saying here that we can still care about helping persons who have reduced incomes as a result of various policy prescriptions, but that the basis for public policy prescriptions always and everywhere should be based on attaining a higher aggregate income than would be possible under any inferior set of policies. For Kaldor, then, since all of these cases make people better off than they were before, or at any rate, since all of the public policies based on human welfare make people better off than they do before, what we can find is that scientific comparisons can only be grounded in human welfare and not in preference satisfaction. But we need to ask whether these persons who, say, have different preferences than those that are actual public policies should be compensated in a different way, for instance, payments in kind or some other form of compensation. We should start with a highly realistic idea of trade-offs that will be faced between different economic agents whenever there is an economic decision to be made. So the division of welfare economics goes into two parts. The first part is concerned with the production of wealth, and the second part is concerned with the distribution of wealth. Now, with regards to the first, the most significant priority for economists is to encourage policies where there is some form of social welfare related to the aggregate production of wealth. According to Kaldor, the supreme advantage of this system is that where we do tend to see greater aggregate wealth, there's proof in the pudding, so to speak, that shows which behaviors we should encourage that lead to these favorable outcomes, and this applies as well to the wealth that's to be redistributed. The second part concerns the distribution of wealth as such. Regarding this, Kaldor says economists should not be too quick to endorse any policy prescriptions. These are matters of politics. What is crucial is that political battles not disrupt unduly the process of wealth creation. For those policies that increase aggregate wealth will be the ones that we can consider once it comes time to examine the question of redistribution of wealth. Now, there are various objections that have been raised to the Kaldor-Hicks efficiency criterion, and one of them was raised by the economist Lionel Robbins. Robbins questioned whether we really can, as a matter of fact, attain economic objective and scientific analyses based on human welfare. Robbins attempted to show that scientific judgments are merely descriptive and that there are no normative judgments that can be obtained from these. He once said that objective analysis of the effects of the repeal of the Corn Laws in England only showed that consumers gained and landlords lost. Now, this tells us only something descriptive. What Robbins was attempting to show is the limits of science to prescribe policy when we're trying to decide who should gain and who should lose when it comes to policy matters. It simply is not clear, according to him, that we can derive a general truth about policy regarding which groups we ought to favor, just based on human welfare. Now, how might Kaldor reply to this objection by Robbins? Well, according to Kaldor, there actually is an objective basis that we can discover when it comes to policy prescriptions. So when we're assessing which policies to prescribe, we need not simply make decisions based on which groups we intuitively want to favor. After all, we have economic history that we can use to observe what happens when we make certain kinds of decisions about wealth distribution. The effect of the repeal of the Corn Laws could be summarized as follows in an objective way. 1, it results in the reduction of the price of corn, so that the same money income now represents a higher real income for all the citizens concerned. 2, it leads to a shift in the distribution of income, so that some people, i.e. landlords, will have lower incomes than before, and people whose incomes were lower, that is producers, will have higher incomes. The basic idea here is that there is a genuine change in distribution of the income of various persons involved as a result of the repeal of the Corn Laws. The repeal was a boon to the British economy. At the same time, says Kaldor, if the government ever became convinced that the loss of additional income to landlords was problematic for the economy as a whole, the way to help these landlords would be to tax those with augmented incomes, that is, the producers, so as to allow for some compensation to the landlords, but without doing so in a way that would raise the prices of those whose incomes were quite low. John Rawls also raised an objection to Kaldor-Hicks and their criterion. Now, like Rawls, Kaldor thought that we should regard equality as itself as a good thing, but not as a basis for policy prescriptions. And the reason is simple, namely, for Kaldor, we cannot simply presuppose that equality is the most desirable social outcome in the sense of being the most efficient outcome, without looking at the empirical evidence about costs and benefits. For Rawls, on the other hand, and he states this more clearly in his classic work, A Theory of Justice, even where production of wealth means a greater increase in the aggregate wealth. The only inequalities that are permissible are those that lead to an improvement in the conditions of the worst-off citizens. Rawls objects to utilitarian reasoning, such as that Kaldor uses, for Kaldor supposes that since individual persons prefer more to less overall, that therefore policies should be apace with this goal, without regard to the concerns about equality or merit. There is nothing in Kaldor that would necessarily guarantee the priority of the worst-off citizens in the way that Rawls is concerned about, and indeed, under the Kaldor-Hicks efficiency criterion, one implication is that the worst-off people in society may need to take a back seat to whatever policies maximize aggregate wealth that might be produced. Rawls would say that even if everyone would be made better off as individuals under a given set of aggregate wealth producing policies, in contrast to what would be produced under the Rawlsian system of distributive justice, nonetheless, the principles of justice require us to recognize that only those policy prescriptions that aim explicitly to help those worst off can be justified in political philosophy and in the formation of economic policy. We may, however, allow for the inverse, where a reduction in aggregate social wealth leads to the betterment of the worse-off persons under Rawls's system. Now, how might Kaldor reply to Rawls's objection here? Well, Kaldor would say that moral considerations about equality cannot themselves be used to guide economic policy because such is empirically infeasible. Kaldor would draw a distinction between the egalitarian moral convictions that people like Rawls have on the one hand, with, say, the feasibility of policy goals on the other. He might argue that if we want to know why it is that a Rawlsian society has never been realized, at least at a political level, it is precisely because the policy goals oriented toward the object of attaining egalitarian ends is not something that even the most benevolent government could do. Besides, we are better off morally by adopting policies based on the Kaldor-Hicks efficiency criterion, because such gives us a tangible way to assess costs and benefits of policies in particular regimes well apart from the preferences that individual people may have. We're by no means finished talking about the philosophy of economics and about welfare economics in particular, and as we'll see, the battle between economists and philosophers is a significant one that still continues today. Thank you for watching, and until next time, please continue to seek truth and to pursue the examined life.